Hi, this is Mark Schroeder, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my paper, Attributive Silencing. Attributive silencing explores the concept of, you guessed it, attributive silencing, and it's recently published in Oxford Studies in Normative Ethics. The goal of the paper is to explore the concept of attributive silencing. Attributive silencing is not original to me. It's originally introduced by the philosopher Mary Kate McGowan in her book Just Words. But in my paper, what I try to do is to explore the concept and show exactly how useful it is in making sense of the phenomenon of silencing. Attributive silencing, like other kinds of silencing, is a phenomenon which makes it the case that people have difficulty communicating with one another. But what makes attributive silencing distinctive is that instead of having light shed on this phenomenon from the philosophy of language or epistemology, as other forms of silencing have already been explored in philosophy, attributive silencing has light shed on it from the philosophy of action. It comes from the concept of attributability. Attributability is a concept that comes from the philosophy of action. So we start with the idea that among the various things that somebody might do, for example, they might snap at you in anger, telling you to leave them alone, and thereby speaking in accent. Some of the things that they do are signal and some are noise. For example, typically, if somebody tells you to leave them alone, we expect that they're telling you is signal, their accent is noise, and we can imagine different kinds of cases in which the snap is signal or the snap is noise. The snap, for example, might be signal if they are genuinely angry or frustrated at you, and the snap might be noise if they're only snapping at you because they're hangry, because it's been too long since they've eaten. But we can imagine situations in which the accent is signal. They're choosing to speak in a particular accent because they're a voice actor and they're able to speak in that way. And we can imagine situations in which the telling is noise. For example, maybe they're only telling you to leave them alone because they're drunk or upset or under the influence of drugs. So the question of what's attributable to somebody and what isn't is a kind of signal-noise distinction that we make in the philosophy of action. Let's grant for a moment that there is this distinction, that some actions are attributable to us and some actions or behaviors are not attributable to us. It follows immediately, since none of us will be perfect at applying that distinction to one another, that gaps can come to exist between how we interpret one another in terms of what's attributable to somebody and what is genuinely attributable to them. So take Alex, for example, in the case of Alex's snap. We have Alex's snap. And one possibility is that the snap is genuinely attributable to Alex. And one possibility is that it's not. Similarly, Pat might be trying to interpret Alex. So Pat has some interpretation of what is signal and what is noise with respect to Alex's behavior. According to Pat's interpretation, let me catch up. According to Pat's interpretation, Alex's snap might be signal or it might be noise. Now, if Pat interprets Alex's snap as signal, as attributable to Alex, and that snap is genuinely attributable to Alex, then everything's going to be going happy. Similarly, if Pat correctly diagnoses Alex's snap as not attributable to Alex, recognizing that Alex is merely hangry and this is not a signal, doesn't tell us anything important about how Alex is feeling, then everything's going to be going well. However, if Pat interprets Alex's snap as attributable to Alex, but it's not actually attributable to Alex, then Pat's going to have a false positive for attributability. And likewise, if Pat interprets Alex's signal as not attributable to Alex, but in fact it really is, then Pat's going to have a false negative for attributability to Alex. Attributive silencing is when the interpreter comes up with a false negative for the attributability of some action to somebody, where that action is a matter of speech. Because there's no perfect way of determining what's attributable to somebody and what's not, it's always going to be the case that avoiding at least some false positives is going to require interpreters to commit to the risk of at least some false negatives. And that means that rational, well-meaning interpreters are always going to fall into the mistake of sometimes having false negatives for attributability. That means that rational interpreters are always going to at least sometimes be involved in attributive silencing. So why is this important, and how does it fit into the rest of my research? Well, I believe that there are at least 4 important reasons why this is particularly important. The first is that because attributive silencing is unavoidable, it's a direct consequence of the fact that there's no perfect test for what's attributable to somebody. It's inevitable that attributive silencing is going to be part of every human relationship. As long as you are interpreting somebody over a large enough range of things, in order to avoid at least some false positives, you are at least sometimes going to have false negatives for your interpretation of them. That means that this is a phenomenon, a kind of misunderstanding that's important for all of us to understand because it's part of every human relationship. Second, I think that attributive silencing is really important because actually once we understand attributive silencing, we realize that it ceases to be actually that important who's silenced and who isn't. Even if we avoid the question of who's silenced and who isn't, Alex is going to have interpretation of themselves. So just like we could compare Pat's interpretation of Alex's snap to Alex's snap, to the actual facts of what's attributable to Alex, we could also compare it to Alex's interpretation. And now what our table shell tells us is not where Pat is committing a false positive or false negative with respect to Alex's snap. Instead, what it tells us is where, according to Alex's interpretation of themselves, Pat is committing a false positive or false negative. What this means is that even if people's interpretations are correct, they can be perceived by the person they're interpreting as attributively silencing them. And this is an important phenomenon in itself. This is part of the phenomenon that I call discord and explore in other work. Here's a third reason why I find attributive silencing to be particularly important and interesting. If we want to understand not just why it is that people sometimes attributively silence one another, but when it is, and to what degree, and to what extent, under what circumstances we are liable to attributively silence one another, I believe that what we really need to do is we need to have an account of the correct conditions of attributability. The correct conditions of attributability, however, are the conditions under which what you do speaks for you, as opposed to speaking for the other causes acting on you or in you, the influence of drugs or hormones or being tired or your environment or your situation. But if we want to understand what speaks for you, we need to understand what it is to be you. And that means that ultimately, in order to solve this problem and have more insight into the nature of attributive silencing, what we really need is a philosophical account of the nature of persons. So I find that quite exciting. Here's a fourth thing that I find exciting. If what we really need in order to understand the conditions of attributive silencing is a philosophical theory of the nature of persons and how persons fit into the world of things, then it turns out that philosophy is important for ordinary life, not just in methodology, in that philosophy forces us to think rigorously and more carefully, but also in content, because the question of how persons fit into the world of things is one of the fundamental ancient questions of philosophy. And so understanding the answers to that fundamental ancient question of philosophy helps us to understand something important about human relationships, the risk we have misunderstanding one another in ordinary situations. Then what that shows is that philosophy matters in content and not just in style. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed listening to my presentation of the outlines of this paper. Hope you look at it and let me know what you think. Thanks.